The Gravedigger's Tales. I was staying in the region of Eidsvoll, a nice enough place, to be sure, with quite a nice church, but not much to do, except attend to the mandatory constitutional walk that one takes in these sort of places. On my second day, I went to seek Per Gravedigger in Store Finstad, a good league south of the river. After a while among the disorderly clusters of outhouses and farmhouses, I found his dwelling place. When I looked, there was no one in the parlour, but an old woman sat in a gloomy cabin, spinning. I asked her some questions. The first one received no answer, but a look, as if she were getting the measure of me. The second and third both received a "huh?" When I finally asked for the fourth time, rather exasperated now, if she could please tell me where the chap, this Per Gravedigger, was, she answered, "Oh, it's still a good league to the grave yet." "No, Per Gravedigger!" I shouted. I somewhat regretted it. She was an old woman, after all. "Yes, the grave lies eastwards. If you go along the valley, you'll find it." I later discovered that the neighbouring farm is in fact called Grave. "Grandmother is hard of hearing," piped up a voice from a shadowy corner, where the light had just begun to shine. It was a young girl with a small child on her arm. "Can you tell me where I can find this Per Gravedigger?" I asked her. He's not at home," she answered. "You don't know where he is?" "I suppose he's at Sturry, my aunt's." "Where's Sturry, then?" "On the east side." "Is that far?" "Dunno." "Is no one else at home?" "Nah, they all went to a wedding." "And in the next cabin?" "Dunno." Fortunately, in the next cabin, they were more forthcoming with the information that I needed. There was nothing to do but go on to Sturry. Outside in the passage, I met the aunt that the child had mentioned. She was a tall, thin, prim, middle-aged housewife, her grey hair scraped up into a bun under a woolen black hat. With a measured, dry cordiality, she came to meet me, and said, "Please, do come in," getting a little disheartened, due to the difficulties that I had already experienced. I asked her if Per Gravedigger was there. "Would you like to order a grave?" she asked. No, it's not that. I have heard that he supposedly knows very many old tales and stories, and I wanted to hear some." "Oh, well, in that case, if only old Anders, Per's father, had been here. Well, he was a man who could tell a tale or three. When he began, there was no stopping him. Yet another person to track down? Dear God. Well, can you show me where old Anders is?" "Well, I certainly can. However, he won't be of much use, as he has been dead for 2 years. Per knows some stories too, but it's not as easy to get him in the mood to tell them. He is a little difficult like that, you know. No, old Anders, he could tell stories. One didn't need to ask him twice. But this year, it'll be just 2 years ago since he died, this Michaelmas." "Well, that doesn't help me much," I interrupted, irritated that this blasted Anders was apparently only to be contacted via necromancy, an art in which, like most people, I have no practical experience. "Is Per not here?" "Well, now you say it, he was here. It's true, but he wanted to see the sexton. You'll find him at the sexton's, and if he's not there, he'll be at Blacken, or the parsonage. If he's not in the churchyard, digging a grave, you see old Mother Haberstadt is dead." My patience was very nearly at an end. However, it seemed that one must have a near endless reserve of such when dealing with Per Gravedigger. I decided to save my last scrap. I tried to make a move to leave, but now the old aunt had taken a suspiciously cloudy-looking glass from the dresser and poured a dram of brandy, which she presented to me, together with a piece of candied sugar, on a plate, while she reminisced, reiterating that old Anders had been without equal in the telling of tales. Per is probably nearly at the sexton's, and if not there, then he's at Backen, or the parsonage, if he's not in the churchyard, she called after me, as I left through the gate, going back in the very direction from which I had came. So I determined that the best place to look for him was probably the last place, the place that in her opinion was the least probable. It was one of those horrible, cold, miserable summer days as I went over to the church, winding my way through the dark alleys in the parsonage gardens. The worst of the rain had stopped, but with every gust of wind it dripped down from the trees. The fog and the clouds were low to the ground between the canopy tops. The light fell faint and grey over the graves and simple plaques. The wind whistled through the branches, and not a single bird sang. The shadow of autumn already seemed to hang over this still, quiet, lonely meadow, in which only the church stood, its tower and spire pointing towards the heavens. From the farthest corner of the churchyard I heard the clang of his spade. The grave-digger stood digging a grave. On a knoll, close by, stood the sexton's great goat, a magnificent beast, whom I recognized from previous visits, with his shaggy beard and huge horns, eating grass. I stood a while, and regarded the gravedigger. He was an aging man, and it wasn't looking well on him. One would expect such a profession to put life into perspective, to perhaps inspire philosophical thoughts about the nature of it all. But he looked upon the world with a bitter expression. His face seemed familiar. I searched my memory for it, and eventually recognized it. He bore a striking resemblance to a stubborn horse I had once been troubled with. When he paused his work for a moment to rest, he looked up and caught sight of me. I had hitherto managed to go unnoticed. "Good afternoon, gravedigger," I said. He looked me up and down, spat into his palms, and began to work again. "Pretty hard work in this wet weather," I continued, unfazed. "Yeah, well, it's no bloody easier in the sunshine, to be honest," he replied with a scowl, continuing to dig. "Who's, that for?" I asked, in a vague hope that some sort of conversation might arise from the inquiry. "For the devil and the church," the gravedigger snapped. Somewhat puzzled, I asked for clarification. "Devil takes the soul, church gets the money," he replied. "Well, let me rephrase. What I actually meant to ask is who is going to occupy it?" "A dead woman," answered the gravedigger. The bridge I had been attempting to build was thus unceremoniously demolished. I realized this wasn't going anywhere. Not wishing to get soaked with the rain, which had again begun to fall, and irritated over what appeared to have been a wild goose chase, I told the gravedigger that I had sought him out to hear tales and stories from the olden days, and he wouldn't have to just tell them for nothing, and that he should really be pleased to tell them to someone like myself. After all, I believed in such things that people usually ridiculed in our days. From time to time during my speech, the gravedigger looked at me with beady, horse-like eyes. His looks threw a shadow across my hopes. "Whether folk believe what I tell them, or disbelieve, I'm just as happy," he said. "But what I have heard, and what I know that I know, I will not be someone's fool, sitting and telling them stories like a gossip wife, even if it were the king himself," he added, for extra confirmation. I had already begun to leave, when he stopped his work once more, half turned away from me. After pushing his hat over to one side, He began to rummage, first in one, then in the other of his waistcoat pockets. However, he did not seem to find what he was searching for. His face grew visibly longer, especially after he had completed a new, resultless search of both of his pockets. I quickly understood that he had run out of tobacco, and in satisfaction I saw that my luck had turned. In my botany crate I had one of Tideman's sought-after quarter rolls, and as I feigned, reaching for my handkerchief, by means of a sleight of hand I caused it to fall on the very edge of the grave which he was digging. Quite calmly I bent down to pick it up, but studied not to notice the ray of sun that crossed the grave-digger's face in delight at the sight. As if I was lost in thought, I picked it up, called to my horned friend, which stood on the edge of the grave close by, and let it bite off a large part of the roll. "How far is it to Turnsacker?" I asked. The grave-digger mumbled something about abusing God's gifts, but he answered a lot more politely than previously, and said that it was about half a mile on the other side of the Sound. "And to the gold works?" I asked. "That'd be 7 miles, said the gravedigger. "Where's this fellow come from, then, if I may be so bold as to ask?" he added, with the oddest of looks on his face. "Most recently I came from Store Finstadt, where I asked after Per Gravedigger," I replied, laying the roll back in the crate, after giving the goat yet another bite. To this there was no answer, but Per began digging eagerly. Beside the earth and stones he threw up half-rotten splinters and crumbling bones with his spade, and among the bones that rolled towards my feet was a female skull of such beautiful and perfect shape that Resius would have considered it of an ideal Scandinavian type. I picked it up and looked at it carefully. "It was no old woman who owned that skull," the gravedigger began again. "I can see," I replied. "She was a farmer's wife, here in the village, and she was held in respect and honour. Indeed, had the gravedigger still been inclined to be contrary, he would no doubt have left it there, but the alluring prospect of a roll of tobacco had the most remarkable effect on his mood. Cranky on the inside, spotless on the outside. I gave no answer. "But that is a most fine tobacco you have there, in that little tin box of yours." "This rascal clearly thinks so too," I laughed, as I beckoned the goat and made as if to feed it more. "I've only old Anders my father were alive," said the gravedigger hastily, as he attempted to hinder the goat in its cheerful munching with a spare femur. "He could tell stories. What I know is not much." "Ah, you want a piece of tobacco? Well, Per Gravedigger, you should have said. The goat's already had half of it. Why, if you'd have said earlier, I would have swapped you the whole roll for some tails. How about you tell me some now, and I'll let you have the rest?" "Well, you know, I suppose I could then. Just a few. You seem like a man of your word, and not some scallywag," replied the gravedigger as he hastily picked up his tools and clambered out of the grave. "Damned idiot thing!" he shouted maliciously, striking the goat with the bone. "Bloody hate goats. Vermin. Should be killed, the lot of them." After getting that off his chest, he sat down on a gravestone and began to tell a story. "All right, you're not the first person I've told this to," he began. "Don't matter to me one bit if you believe it or not. Right, so there was this farmer in the village. He'd heard that witches would gather to play in the church at night during the holidays. He didn't believe it, see, but he wanted to see if it was real, and he wanted to know who the witches was in the village. So, night before Easter, he sits himself in a pal in the church passage, and just like that, a whole lot of them arrived, with a great big black dog. When they came to the church door, dog stands up on its hind legs and paws at the door, which opened, even though it always gets locked. "You see that?" said the woman who was closest to the dog. And it was her here," added the gravedigger, as he held up the skull. "No, I never would have believed it, even if you had told me," the other one replied, who walked beside her. "And she was a good woman in the village here. So many followed after them now that he almost couldn't keep count. But he knew them all, and he never would have believed that there were as many witches in all Romerike as those he saw there just from Eidsvoll parish. They jumped, and they did all the blasphemous things that anyone might imagine, both in the pulpit and on the altar. When they ran out of things to do, they conjured a cow up in the tower, and let it slide down the stairs with all four legs in the air. He thought he recognised the cow as belonging to the parsonage, and when the witches were done, and everything was over in the church, then he went over to the parsonage. When he came into the stall there, he found the cow. It was quaking, and so sweaty that it frothed at the mouth. But then, once upon a time, a long time afterwards, there was a wedding, and the master of the kitchen at the wedding was the same man who had seen all this on the evening before Easter, and the woman who had led the flock of witches was also there. When it was time to sit at the table, they wanted her to take her seat first, for she was such a good wife, you know. But she was now so bashful, and made herself precious without measure. The master of the kitchen begged and pleaded with her to take her seat, but finally he grew weary of this. So he said to her quite deliberately, "Go first. You're used to it by now, I should think. You were not in the least bit shy the last time I saw you, which was at Easter, when you were the first in the dance with old Eric, both on the altar and in the pulpit." Then she fainted, and from that time she had not a single day of good health. The gravedigger fell silent, and his face again assumed its dour, contrary expression. But I persisted in asking about witches, their journeys, and their goings-on, and examining him for so long that I got him to promise to tell me everything he knew of such things. "There were some shooters," he began, "who were at a bird-leg one night at Easter. Just as they sat in the hide, in the morning twilight, they heard such a roar and a rush from the sky that they almost believed it to be a great flock of birds coming to settle on the moor. But the devil it was birds. When they came over the tops of the forest, it was a flock of witches that had been out at an Easter leg. They came riding on brooms, on billy goats and nanny goats, on muckrakes, and on the most unreasonable things that can be imagined. When they were close by, one of the shooters recognized a witch, for she was a neighbour to one of them. 'Maren Myra,' he cried, and she fell down in a pine tree, and broke a leg at the thigh, for when one recognizes them and calls them by their name, then they have to come down, no matter how high. They picked her up and delivered her to the sheriff, and in the end she was to be burned alive. But before they got her up to the pyre, she asked if they would take the scarf from her eyes a little. Yes, they would do so, but first they turned her away so she could not look towards the fields and the meadows, but far out across the hills. And wherever she laid her eyes, the forest was scorched, quite black. But this woman left a daughter behind her, and they placed her with the parson, in Gudbrandsdalen. She can't have been more than 9 years old, but she was mean and full of witchery. Once the parson told her to carry some wooden shingles that were lying in the yard to the kitchen. 'Bah! I'm sure I could get them there without carrying them,' she said. 'Really?' said the parson. 'Let me see.' Well, she immediately conjured a wind so that the shingles flew into the kitchen. The parson asked her if she could do more. Yes, she could. She could milk, she said, but she did not like to, for it injured the cattle. The parson asked her to, but she was reluctant. In the end, though, she would do it anyway. So she stuck a knife into the wall and placed a milk churn underneath, and as soon as she touched the knife, the milk ran into the churn. When she had milked for a while, she wanted to stop. 'Oh no, you continue milking, my child,' said the parson. No, she would not. But the parson spoke to her for so long that she began again. 'Now I must stop,' she said after a little while, 'for otherwise there will only come blood.' 'Oh no, you continue milking,' said the parson, "and don't you worry about that." She did not want to, but eventually she gave in and continued milking. After a while she said, "Well, if I don't stop now, the best cow will lie dead in the stall." "Milk on, my child, and don't concern yourself about that," said the parson, for he wanted to see what she could do. She was reluctant, but the parson pressed her until she gave in and continued milking. "Now the cow has collapsed," she said, and they went out to the shed to see. The best cow the parson owned lay dead in the stall. So they burned her too, just like they had done her mother. "Yes, she was a terrible witch, that one I've just told you about," continued the gravedigger. "But there was one who I think was even worse. For she took her husband out of bed one night, and rode on his back all the way from Gudbrandsdalen to the church in Bergen. And while she was up in the tower, observing the Easter Lek with the others and old Eric, her husband had to lie stark naked outside the church, freezing the whole night. And it was terrible weather. The snow drifted, and the man was so exhausted that he was most desperate. When morning approached, he got up a little, but he was freezing and his teeth were chattering. Just then, someone came walking by. 'In God's name, please tell me where I am,' said the man. 'Well, you are at the church in Bergen,' he replied. And when he saw the girth that the man wore around his middle, then he understood how things stood. For witches were there both at Easter and at Christmas, in those days. And then he said, 'When she comes out, the one you were with, then take the girth, throw it over her from behind, and ride home again, or you won't be able to stand it.' Well, when the witches came out, the man did what he said, and rode her home as quick as you like." Now the gravedigger said he could not remember any more witch stories. But since he had begun so well, I thought I should take the opportunity to ask him if he had any to tell of the subterraneans. He said, "I might well have heard something from my aunt, perhaps. When she was a girl, she was at Modum, in service with the parson there. Tileman, I think she called him. Once upon a time in the spring, when the manure was to be spread, the parson enlisted a lot of folk, for he was a great man, to farm the land, and he asked folk from far and wide and all corners of the village to help. So an apprentice to a man was also invited, but he was unreasonably enthusiastic about his work. When his master told him one evening to go to bed so that he could be ready to drive to the fields at 8, he was so glad that he lay tossing and turning all night and could not sleep. There was no clock there, so he couldn't tell what time it was, and so he got up at midnight, harnessed the horses, and drove to the parsonage. But no living soul there was up yet at such an hour, so he walked around, watching out for something to pass the time. Just as he walked, he came into the churchyard, and he washed the sleep from his eyes in a ditch that was full of water, for there had recently been a shower of rain, and from that time he had second sight. But he was half distracted too, and they called him mad. Either he left the service, or he served out the year. I couldn't say which, but afterwards he wandered, hanging round the village, when there was a banquet or something else happening, and offered to chase out the subterraneans. One time there was a wedding on the farm, called Presterud, and they were baptizing a baby at Komperud on the same day. Then he was confused, for he couldn't decide which he should go to, but in the end he went to the wedding. When he had been sitting there for a while, he caught hold of the master of the kitchen. "You look after well what you have," he said. "Don't you see that the subterraneans are drinking from the beer tub that you've put in the corner there? Each moment it grows emptier. But if you will allow me to stay while the wedding lasts, I will chase them away." "Yes, you can stay. But how will you get them out?" the master of the kitchen asked. "Oh, you'll see," said the boy. He took the tub, put it in the midst of the floor, and drew a large chalk ring around it. "Now take a large club," he said to the master of the kitchen, "and when I wave at you, then strike, in the middle of the ring. It makes no difference where I am. When I have got them all in the ring, then strike with all your might." When he had said this, he began to run around. He went both high and low, shooing and chasing them into the ring. The master of the kitchen could hardly keep on his feet, for he was laughing so hard at the mad boy's antics, and everyone who saw him thought him mad. But then they saw that he was not as mad as they had supposed, for when he waved the master of the kitchen, and the master of the kitchen struck, there was a scream and a whine that was heard throughout the house, and someone who came to the wedding farm from the direction of Comperud told that they had heard such a rushing and a whining in the air that sounded like a crowd of folk all speaking at the same time, to Comperud, to wet the baby's head. To Comperud, to wet the baby's head. Here ended Per Gravedigger's tales. He could remember no more that evening, he said, and began chasing the sexton's goat out of the churchyard.